You know that moment when silence becomes so thick, you can practically taste the privilege dripping from every chandelier in the room? That's exactly where I found myself on that December evening, sitting at table 7 of the grand ballroom at the Meridian Hotel, surrounded by men in $1,000 suits who somehow managed to make their wealth look cheap through their attitudes. My name is Amara, and this is the story of how a single sentence changed everything, not just for me, but for every person in that room who thought they knew exactly who I was and what I represented. The annual Sterling Industries executive dinner was always a spectacle of corporate theater, where handshakes meant more than handwritten contracts, and where the real business happened in whispered conversations between the appetizer and the main course. I had attended these events for 3 years now, watching the same dance of egos and politics play out like a Broadway show that had run too long, but somehow kept selling tickets. The ballroom was decorated in that particular shade of corporate elegance that screamed expensive but whispered boring, with crystal glasses that caught the light just right, and floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I was seated strategically, or so I thought, at a table that mixed senior managers with rising executives, the kind of placement that suggested I was being groomed for something bigger, but not quite ready for the main stage yet. To my left sat Marcus Chen from International Operations, a brilliant strategist who had doubled our Asian market share in 18 months. To my right was Jennifer Walsh from Marketing, whose campaign for our new sustainable packaging had won 3 industry awards. Across from me sat the man who would become the unwitting catalyst for everything that followed. James Davenport, Senior Director of Strategic Development, a 62-year-old relic from an era when boardrooms were exclusively populated by men who looked exactly like him and thought exactly like him. The evening began predictably enough, with the kind of small talk that serves as social lubricant in corporate settings. We discussed quarterly projections, the upcoming merger with the European subsidiary, and the challenges of maintaining growth in an increasingly competitive market. I contributed thoughtfully to each conversation, offering insights that came from my unique position of having access to information that crossed multiple departments. You see, what most people at that table didn't know was that I wasn't just another high-potential employee being developed for future leadership. I was already leading just quietly, strategically, and without the fanfare that usually accompanies executive power. The first course arrived, some elaborate seafood creation that looked more like modern art than food, and the conversation shifted to more personal topics. Jennifer mentioned her daughter's acceptance to Yale. Marcus talked about his wife's new art gallery, and then the attention turned to me. "And what about you, Amara?" Davenport asked with that particular tone that older white executives use when they're trying to sound inclusive, but somehow manage to make you feel like a specimen under a microscope. "How are you finding your role here at Sterling? It must be quite an adjustment, coming into such a prestigious environment." The way he emphasized prestigious made it clear that he didn't think I belonged in such an environment, that my presence was somehow an anomaly that needed explanation. I smiled that smile I had perfected over years of navigating predominantly white spaces, the one that conveyed warmth without vulnerability, confidence without aggression. "I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had here," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "The company has given me the chance to contribute in ways I never imagined possible." It was a diplomatic answer, the kind that acknowledged the question without giving him the ammunition he was fishing for. But Davenport wasn't satisfied with diplomacy. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with the casual arrogance of a man who had never had to watch his words or wonder if he belonged anywhere. "Well, you certainly have had unique opportunities," he continued, and something in his tone made the entire table go quiet. Marcus stopped cutting his fish. Jennifer's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest that comes when you sense danger approaching, but can't quite see it yet. I mean, let's be honest about the current climate. Companies like ours are under tremendous pressure to diversify, to show that we're progressive, that we're keeping up with the times. He took a sip of his wine, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort he was creating, or perhaps relishing it. It's admirable, really, how the company has embraced these initiatives, making sure everyone has a seat at the table, if you know what I mean. The subtext was clear to everyone present, but Davenport wasn't content with subtext. He never was. That's when he leaned toward his neighbor, David Kumar from legal, but spoke just loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Between you and me, David, it's obvious she's here as part of the diversity quota. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure she's capable enough. But let's not pretend this is purely merit-based. The optics matter more than the substance these days." The words hit the table like a physical blow. Jennifer actually gasped audibly. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair, and David Kumar looked mortified that he had been made an unwilling co-conspirator in Davenport's casual racism. But I sat perfectly still, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed, my wineglass steady in my hand. Because in that moment, I realized that James Davenport had just given me the greatest gift possible. He had revealed exactly who he was, in front of witnesses, in a way that could never be taken back or explained away. You see, what James Davenport didn't know, what none of them knew except for the man who would later take the stage, was that I wasn't just an employee of Sterling Industries. I wasn't just another rising executive being groomed for future leadership. I was the architect of Sterling Industries' most successful strategic initiatives of the past 3 years, the invisible hand that had guided the company through its most challenging periods, and the future CEO of the company that employed every single person in that room. But let me tell you how we got here, because the story of this moment begins long before that December evening, in the quiet corridors of power, where real decisions are made and real leaders are forged. 3 months earlier, I had been sitting in my father's office, not as his daughter, but as his most trusted advisor, discussing the future of the company he had built from the ground up. Robert Sterling wasn't just the CEO of Sterling Industries. He was a visionary who understood that the business world was changing, that the old ways of thinking were not just outdated, but dangerous for long-term success. "The European crisis is getting worse," he had said, pointing to the charts spread across his mahogany desk. "Our Hamburg facility is bleeding money, the supply chain is completely disrupted, and our European division head seems to think the solution is to throw more resources at the same failed strategies." He looked tired, older than his 65 years, worn down by the constant pressure of keeping a multinational corporation profitable in an increasingly complex global economy. "I need someone to go over there, someone who understands both the operational challenges and the cultural dynamics, someone who can think outside the traditional corporate playbook." I had nodded, already mentally preparing for what I knew would be a challenging assignment. "When do you need me to leave?" I asked. And he smiled with the kind of pride that only a father can have for a daughter who has exceeded every expectation he ever had. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this job," he said. "You don't ask if you can do it, you ask when you start." The next morning, I was on a plane to Hamburg, armed with full authority to make whatever changes were necessary to turn the European operation around. What I found in Hamburg was exactly what I had expected. A facility stuck in operational patterns that had worked 20 years ago, but were completely inadequate for current market conditions, managed by executives who were more concerned with protecting their territories than solving problems. The supply chain issues weren't technical problems. They were relationship problems. The quality control failures weren't system problems. They were communication problems. The cost overruns weren't budget problems. They were accountability problems. Within 72 hours, I had identified the core issues, developed a comprehensive restructuring plan, and begun implementing changes that would save the company over $15 million annually. But here's what made the Hamburg turnaround special. I did it without anyone back at corporate headquarters knowing the details. To them, I was just another executive on a fact-finding mission. The reports that came back to Sterling Industries simply stated that the European operation had undergone a successful restructuring under the guidance of corporate oversight. James Davenport, whose strategic development department was supposed to be responsible for exactly this kind of operational improvement, took credit for the success during the next quarterly board meeting. He stood up in front of the board of directors and presented his Hamburg solution as an example of the kind of innovative thinking that his department brought to the company. I sat in that board meeting, listening to Davenport describe my work as his own, watching him bask in the praise of board members who were impressed by the dramatic turnaround, and I said nothing. Not because I was afraid to speak up, not because I didn't want the credit, but because I understood something that Davenport didn't. Real power doesn't come from taking credit for individual successes. Real power comes from being indispensable, from being the person that others depend on, even when they don't realize they're depending on you. Hello, beautiful souls, and welcome back to Black Revenge Diaries, where we explore the stories of those who turned prejudice into power, discrimination into determination, and underestimation into unstoppable success. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, because today's story is going to show you exactly why excellence is always the most devastating response to ignorance. And trust me, what you're about to hear will make you understand why sometimes the best revenge is simply being undeniably, unquestionably, and unapologetically brilliant. The Hamburg success was just the beginning. Over the next 18 months, while James Davenport continued to believe that I was simply another diversity hire taking up space in the executive ranks, I was quietly revolutionizing how Sterling Industries operated. When our primary supplier in Southeast Asia threatened to break their contract unless we agreed to price increases that would have cost us $12 million annually, it was my relationships with alternative suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand that saved the company. When our main competitor launched an aggressive campaign to poach our top clients, it was my understanding of client psychology and market positioning that helped us not only retain those clients, but actually expand our contracts with them. But perhaps the most significant intervention came during what we now call the Australian crisis. Our Sydney subsidiary had been struggling for 2 years, posting consecutive quarterly losses and burning through cash reserves at an alarming rate. The traditional corporate response would have been to either sell the subsidiary or shut it down entirely, accepting the loss and moving on. But I saw something that others missed. The Australian operation wasn't failing because of market conditions or competitive pressure. It was failing because it was trying to operate as a traditional Western company in a market that required a completely different approach. I spent 6 weeks in Sydney, not as a corporate troubleshooter but as a student, learning the Australian business culture, understanding the relationship dynamics that drive success in that market, and identifying the unique value propositions that would resonate with Australian clients. What I discovered was that our Australian operation had been positioned all wrong from the beginning. Instead of trying to compete on price or efficiency, we needed to compete on innovation and customization. Instead of trying to replicate our American business model, we needed to create something specifically designed for the Australian market. The transformation took 8 months, but the results were spectacular. The Sydney subsidiary went from posting losses to generating profits that exceeded our most optimistic projections. More importantly, the strategies we developed in Australia became the foundation for our expansion into New Zealand and eventually into the broader Pacific market. What had seemed like a failing subsidiary became the cornerstone of Sterling Industries' most successful regional expansion in company history. And once again, James Davenport was there to take credit. At the annual leadership conference, he presented the Australian turnaround as an example of his department's strategic thinking and innovative problem-solving. He even used slides that I had prepared, graphs that I had created, and terminology that I had developed to describe the market dynamics that made the success possible. The board was impressed, the investors were satisfied, and Davenport's reputation as a strategic visionary was further enhanced. But what Davenport didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every success he was claiming had been carefully orchestrated by my father and me as part of a larger plan. You see, Robert Sterling understood something that most CEOs never figure out. The best way to identify who really deserves power is to create situations where competence becomes impossible to hide and incompetence becomes impossible to disguise. Every crisis that I solved, every problem that I fixed, every success that Davenport claimed was actually a test, a carefully designed evaluation of not just my abilities, but of the character and competence of the executives around me. The European crisis, the supplier negotiations, the Australian turnaround. These weren't random business challenges that happened to fall into my lap. They were strategic opportunities created by my father to demonstrate to the board, to the investors, and eventually to the entire company that I wasn't just qualified to lead Sterling Industries. I was the only person qualified to lead Sterling Industries into the future it needed to embrace. But none of this was visible to the executives sitting around Table 7 that December evening. To them, I was still just Robert Sterling's adopted daughter, a diversity hire who had somehow managed to hang around long enough to get invited to the important dinners. They saw my youth and mistook it for inexperience. They saw my quiet confidence and mistook it for uncertainty. They saw my strategic patience and mistook it for passivity. James Davenport, in particular, had convinced himself that I was nothing more than window dressing, a token presence that allowed the company to claim diversity while the real work was done by people like him. So when he made his comment about racial quotas, when he dismissed 3 years of my work as nothing more than corporate theater designed to appease diversity initiatives, he wasn't just revealing his own prejudices. He was revealing the fundamental blindness that had prevented him and executives like him from seeing the revolution that was happening right under their noses. He was revealing why companies led by people like him fail, why they stagnate, why they become irrelevant in a rapidly changing business environment. The conversation at Table 7 continued, but it had taken on a different quality after Davenport's comment. Jennifer Walsh tried to change the subject to something safer. Marcus Chen looked uncomfortable every time Davenport spoke, and David Kumar seemed to be calculating how to distance himself from the entire interaction. But Davenport, emboldened by what he perceived as silence in response to his racial quota comment, decided to continue his campaign of casual racism disguised as corporate wisdom. "The thing is," he said, cutting into his steak with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in a professional setting, "and I hope this doesn't sound insensitive, but there's a difference between diversity and qualification. Now, I'm all for giving everyone opportunities, don't get me wrong, but at some point, we have to acknowledge that not everyone is cut out for the pressure and complexity of executive leadership. It takes a certain kind of background, a certain kind of education, a certain kind of, let's call it cultural preparation, to really understand how to operate at the highest levels of corporate strategy." He looked directly at me as he said this, his meaning unmistakable. In his mind, I lacked the cultural preparation necessary for real leadership. I was an outsider who had been given opportunities that I hadn't earned, access to levels of corporate power that I wasn't qualified to navigate. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that while he was making these pronouncements about my qualifications, I was mentally reviewing the email I had sent just that morning to the board of directors, outlining the strategic framework that would guide Sterling Industries' expansion into emerging markets over the next 5 years. What he didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I had been in a video conference with the heads of our major international subsidiaries, coordinating a response to the global supply chain disruptions that were threatening companies across our industry. What he didn't know was that the cultural preparation he thought I lacked had actually prepared me for exactly this kind of moment, had taught me how to recognize ignorance disguised as wisdom, prejudice disguised as professional judgment, and fear disguised as concern for corporate standards. "James," I said quietly, setting down my wineglass and meeting his gaze directly, "I appreciate your concern about maintaining high standards in executive leadership. I think we can all agree that competence should be the primary qualification for any position of responsibility." I paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "I'm curious, though, about your perspective on the Hamburg situation. That was quite a complex challenge, wasn't it? The kind of operational crisis that really requires someone with deep understanding of both the technical and cultural factors involved." Davenport's chest puffed with pride. "Oh, absolutely. That was exactly the kind of strategic challenge that demonstrates why experience matters so much in these situations. It took months of careful analysis and relationship building to identify the root causes and develop viable solutions. Not the kind of problem you can solve with good intentions or politically correct thinking. You need real business acumen, real understanding of how international operations actually work." I nodded thoughtfully. "It's interesting that you mention relationship building. That's such a crucial component of international business success, isn't it? The ability to understand different cultural contexts, to communicate effectively across language barriers, to build trust with partners who have very different ways of doing business." I took a sip of my wine, watching his face carefully. "I imagine someone in your position has extensive experience with that kind of cross-cultural relationship management." "Well, of course," he replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I mean, that's fundamental to any international business operation. You have to understand the local dynamics, the regulatory environment, the competitive landscape. It's complex work that requires someone who really understands how to navigate those kinds of challenges." What James Davenport didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I was the person who had spent 3 weeks in Hamburg building the relationships that made the turnaround possible. I was the one who had learned enough German to conduct meetings in the local language, who had understood that the supply chain problems were rooted in communication breakdowns between the German managers and their Eastern European partners, who had recognized that the solution required not just operational changes but cultural bridge building. I was the one who had worked 18-hour days for 6 weeks, who had flown back and forth between Hamburg, Prague, and Warsaw to personally negotiate the new supplier agreements, who had restructured the entire European operation while Davenport was attending leadership conferences and taking credit for other people's work. But instead of exposing his ignorance in front of the entire table, instead of humiliating him the way he had tried to humiliate me, I simply smiled and said, "You're absolutely right about the complexity. It's the kind of challenge that really reveals who has the skills and experience to handle international operations." The conversation moved on, but something had shifted at the table. Jennifer Walsh was looking at me with new interest. Marcus Chen seemed to be reassessing everything he thought he knew about the executive hierarchy, and David Kumar was clearly uncomfortable with the entire dynamic. But Davenport, oblivious to the undercurrents he had created, continued to hold forth on various topics with the confidence of a man who had never been forced to question his own assumptions. As the evening progressed, as we moved through the elaborate courses and listened to the usual corporate small talk, I found myself thinking about all the moments over the past 3 years when I could have spoken up, when I could have claimed credit for my work, when I could have challenged the assumptions and prejudices that allowed people like Davenport to dismiss my contributions. But I hadn't, not because I was afraid or uncertain, but because I understood something that most people in corporate environments never learn. Sometimes the best strategy is to let others reveal themselves completely before you reveal yourself at all. Every time Davenport took credit for my work, every time he dismissed my qualifications, every time he made assumptions about my capabilities based on his prejudices rather than my performance, he was actually building the case for his own obsolescence. He was demonstrating exactly why Sterling Industries needed new leadership, why the old ways of thinking were not just inadequate, but actively harmful to the company's future success. But if you're enjoying this story of strategic patience and ultimate vindication, make sure you hit that like button and let me know in the comments. What's the best way to handle someone who consistently underestimates your abilities? Do you confront them directly, or do you let their own prejudices become their downfall? Because what happened next is going to show you exactly why sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is simply being so undeniably excellent that silence becomes impossible. The main course was cleared away, and the evening was approaching its climax. The annual address by Robert Sterling himself. This was always the highlight of the corporate dinner, the moment when the CEO shared his vision for the company's future, announced major strategic initiatives, and sometimes made personnel changes that would reshape the executive landscape. I had attended these speeches before, had watched my father command the attention of hundreds of the most powerful people in our industry, but tonight felt different. Tonight, there was an electricity in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. As the waitstaff cleared the tables and dimmed the lights, I caught my father's eye across the room. He was sitting at the head table with the other senior executives and board members, but even from a distance, I could see the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. It was the same smile he had worn when I was 12 years old and had just beaten him at chess for the first time. The smile of a teacher watching his student finally demonstrate mastery of the lessons he had been trying to impart. The lights dimmed further, and a spotlight illuminated the podium at the front of the ballroom. Robert Sterling rose from his seat, and the room fell into the kind of respectful silence that only true power can command. As he walked to the podium, I noticed that every conversation at every table had stopped. Every eye in the room was focused on him. Every person present understood that they were about to hear something important. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room without amplification, "thank you for joining me this evening for what has become one of my favorite traditions of the year. These dinners give us the opportunity to step back from the daily pressures of business and reflect on what we've accomplished together, what challenges we've overcome, and what opportunities lie ahead of us." He paused, scanning the room with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly how to work an audience. This past year has been particularly significant for Sterling Industries. We've expanded into new markets, overcome significant operational challenges, and demonstrated that our company isn't just surviving in a competitive global economy, we're thriving. The room erupted in polite applause, the kind of corporate ovation that acknowledges success while maintaining professional decorum. But success, he continued, is not just about numbers on a financial statement or market share statistics in an industry report. Success is about people. It's about having the right people in the right positions, making the right decisions for the right reasons. It's about building an organization that doesn't just react to change, but anticipates it, doesn't just adapt to new realities, but creates them. I could feel the attention in the room sharpening, could sense that he was building toward something significant. At table 7, even James Davenport had stopped his casual commentary and was listening intently. Jennifer Walsh was leaning forward slightly. Marcus Chen had put down his coffee cup, and David Kumar looked like he was trying to read between the lines of every word. The business world is changing at an unprecedented pace, Robert continued, his tone becoming more serious, more focused. The strategies that made companies successful 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, are not just inadequate for today's challenges. They're actually obstacles to future success. We're operating in a global economy that rewards innovation over tradition, adaptability over rigidity, and fresh thinking over entrenched assumptions. He paused again, and this time his eyes swept across the room more deliberately, making eye contact with specific tables, specific individuals. When his gaze passed over table 7, I saw Davenport straighten in his chair, clearly hoping for some form of recognition or acknowledgement. But my father's attention moved on without the slightest pause, without the smallest indication that he had even noticed Davenport's presence. Over the past 3 years, Robert said, Sterling Industries has faced some of the most complex challenges in our company's history. We've dealt with supply chain disruptions that threatened our core operations, navigated regulatory changes that could have devastated our international subsidiaries, and competed against aggressive new players who were trying to capture our market share through strategies we had never encountered before. The room was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were hearing not just a recitation of past challenges, but a setup for something much more significant. I felt my heart rate increase slightly, not from nervousness, but from anticipation. This was the moment my father and I had been preparing for, the culmination of 3 years of strategic positioning and careful planning. What I want you to understand, he continued, is that Sterling Industries didn't just survive these challenges through luck or circumstance, or the business equivalent of hoping for the best. We thrived because we had someone who saw solutions where others saw problems, who built relationships where others saw obstacles, who created opportunities where others saw limitations. His voice grew stronger, more confident, more definitive. We succeeded because we had a leader who understood that the future of business requires a fundamentally different approach than what has worked in the past. The anticipation in the room was becoming palpable. I could see executives at various tables exchanging glances, trying to figure out what announcement was coming, which senior executive was about to be promoted or recognized or given additional responsibilities. At table 7, Davenport was practically vibrating with excitement, clearly convinced that he was about to receive the recognition he felt he deserved for his supposed strategic contributions. The Hamburg crisis that threatened our European operations, Robert said, and I saw Davenport's eyes light up with anticipation, was resolved not through traditional cost-cutting measures or standard operational adjustments, but through innovative relationship building and cultural intelligence that saved the company over $15 million annually. Davenport was already beginning to smile, already preparing to accept credit for my work. The Australian subsidiary that was hemorrhaging money and appeared to be a complete loss was transformed into our most profitable regional operation through creative market positioning and deep understanding of local business dynamics. Now Davenport was grinning openly, clearly convinced that this public recognition was the prelude to some major promotion or leadership role. He was already mentally preparing his acceptance speech, already thinking about how this moment would enhance his reputation and advance his career. What he didn't see, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that my father was actually building a case against him, documenting for the entire room exactly why the old model of executive leadership was not just inadequate, but actively harmful to the company's future. The supply chain negotiations that protected our profit margins during the global disruptions of the past 18 months, Robert continued, required someone who could think beyond traditional procurement strategies, who could build trust across cultural and linguistic barriers, who could find creative solutions to problems that had stumped our industry's most experienced professionals. He paused, letting the weight of these accomplishments settle over the room. These weren't lucky breaks or favorable market conditions. These were the results of strategic thinking, innovative leadership, and the kind of vision that most organizations only dream of finding in their executive ranks. The room was hanging on every word now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something significant, something that would be remembered and discussed long after the evening was over. I could feel the energy building, could sense that my father was approaching the climax of not just his speech, but of the entire 3-year strategy we had been implementing together. But here's what I want everyone in this room to understand, Robert said, his voice taking on a new intensity, a new focus that demanded absolute attention. The person responsible for these successes, the architect of Sterling Industries' most impressive achievements of the past 3 years, is not who most of you think it is. The silence in the room became absolute, the kind of silence that occurs when hundreds of people simultaneously hold their breath, in anticipation of a revelation that will change everything they thought they understood. At table 7, I watched James Davenport's confident smile begin to falter slightly, watched a flicker of uncertainty cross his face as he began to realize that this speech might not be heading in the direction he had assumed. Jennifer Walsh was staring at the podium with complete focus. Marcus Chen looked like he was trying to solve a puzzle, and David Kumar had gone completely still, as if he understood that he was about to witness something that would redefine everything he thought he knew about the corporate hierarchy at Sterling Industries. The future of this company, Robert continued, will not be built by executives who take credit for other people's work, who assume that their position grants them wisdom, who believe that their experience automatically qualifies them for leadership in a rapidly changing world. His tone was becoming sharper now, more pointed, more clearly directed at specific individuals rather than general principles. The future of Sterling Industries belongs to someone who has already proven that they can succeed, not because of their position, but despite the obstacles that others have placed in their path. I could feel every eye in the room trying to follow the logic of his words, trying to figure out who he was talking about, trying to anticipate the announcement that was clearly coming. But what most of them didn't realize, what they couldn't have realized, was that they had been watching the architect of Sterling Industries' recent successes throughout the entire evening. They had been sitting at tables with her, making small talk with her, and in some cases, dismissing her as irrelevant to the real business of the company. Leadership, Robert said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position and his convictions, is not about maintaining the status quo or protecting existing power structures, or ensuring that things continue to work the way they have always worked. Leadership is about seeing possibilities that others miss, building relationships that others can't build, and creating solutions that others can't imagine. He paused, and in that pause, I could feel the entire trajectory of my career, my life, and my future crystallizing into this single moment. And that's why, he continued, his voice rising with conviction and pride, I am proud to announce that the person who will succeed me as CEO of Sterling Industries, the person who has already proven that they have the vision, the competence, and the strategic brilliance necessary to lead this company into the future, is someone who has been demonstrating extraordinary leadership while others have been taking credit for her work. The possessive pronoun hung in the air like a revelation, like a puzzle piece that suddenly made an entire picture clear. Her work. Not his work, not their work, but her work. In that single word, my father had shattered every assumption, challenged every prejudice, and exposed every unfounded belief that had shaped the way the executives in that room had understood the power dynamics at Sterling Industries. James Davenport's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they hadn't been so revealing. Confusion, realization, disbelief, and finally, a kind of pale shock as he began to understand exactly how wrong he had been about everything. Jennifer Walsh's eyes widened with understanding. Marcus Chen actually smiled with what looked like admiration, and David Kumar looked like he was mentally reviewing every interaction he had ever had with me, reassessing every assumption he had made about my role in the company. "My successor," Robert said, his voice now filled with unmistakable pride and affection, "is someone who has already transformed this company while working behind the scenes, who has already demonstrated the kind of leadership that our industry desperately needs, and who has already proven that excellence is the most powerful response to those who would underestimate her capabilities." He paused one final time, letting the anticipation build to its absolute peak, before delivering the words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to introduce the next CEO of Sterling Industries, my daughter, Amara Sterling." The silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of complete shock, the kind of stunned quiet that occurs when an entire room of people simultaneously realizes that everything they thought they understood has been turned upside down. In that silence, I could hear the sound of assumptions crashing, prejudices collapsing, and carefully constructed corporate hierarchies reorganizing themselves around a new reality. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room, feeling the shift in power dynamics that had just occurred with my father's words. As I rose to my feet, I could see the faces around table 7 with perfect clarity. James Davenport looked like he had been physically struck, his face pale and his mouth slightly open in shock. Jennifer Walsh was smiling now, a genuine smile of recognition and perhaps even relief that someone she had underestimated was actually in a position of real authority. Marcus Chen was nodding slightly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place for him. And David Kumar looked like he was calculating how to completely restructure his understanding of every professional interaction he had ever had with me. But it wasn't just Table 7 that was reacting to the announcement. Throughout the ballroom, I could see executives reassessing every conversation they had ever had with me, every assumption they had made about my role in the company, every casual dismissal of my contributions to Sterling Industries' success. Some faces showed respect, some showed surprise, some showed what looked like embarrassment as they realized how completely they had misunderstood the power dynamics they thought they were navigating. I walked slowly toward the podium, feeling the weight of this moment, not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been dismissed as a diversity hire, every person of color who had been assumed to be less qualified than their white counterparts, every individual who had been underestimated because they didn't fit the traditional image of corporate leadership. This wasn't just my moment of vindication. It was a demonstration of what happens when excellence meets opportunity, when preparation meets the chance to prove oneself, when strategic patience finally reveals its true power. As I reached the podium and stood beside my father, he leaned toward the microphone one more time. "I want everyone in this room to understand something very clearly," he said, his voice carrying absolute authority and unmistakable pride. "Amara didn't earn this position because she's my daughter. She earned this position despite every obstacle that people who look and think like many of you have placed in her path. She earned it through brilliance, through competence, through strategic vision, and through the kind of leadership that this company needs to thrive in the 21st century." He handed me the microphone, and suddenly I was standing in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in our industry, many of whom had spent years underestimating me, dismissing me, or assuming that my presence in their executive ranks was the result of charity rather than capability. The moment was surreal, powerful, and deeply satisfying in a way that I had never quite imagined it would be. "Thank you," I said simply, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for teaching me that the best response to those who question your qualifications is simply to be undeniably, unquestionably, and consistently excellent at what you do." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room, making contact with as many faces as possible. When I first started at Sterling Industries 3 years ago, I knew that I would have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. What I didn't expect was how educational that experience would be, not just about business strategy and operational excellence, but about human nature itself. My gaze found Table 7, found James Davenport specifically, and I allowed myself the smallest smile. I've learned that some people will always see what they expect to see, rather than what's actually in front of them. They'll see a young woman of color in an executive position and assume she's there to fill a quota, rather than considering that she might be there because she's the most qualified person for the job. The room was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. I've learned that some people will take credit for successes they had nothing to do with, while simultaneously questioning whether the person who actually achieved those successes deserves to be in the room where decisions are made. I could see Davenport shifting uncomfortably in his seat, his face growing redder as the implications of my words settled over him. Around him, his table mates were carefully avoiding eye contact, clearly understanding that they were witnessing the kind of moment that becomes corporate legend, the kind of story that gets told and retold in business schools and executive coaching sessions for years to come. But what I've learned most importantly, I continued, is that excellence has a way of speaking for itself, even when others try to silence it or claim it as their own. The Hamburg operation that saved this company $15 million annually wasn't turned around by traditional thinking or old boys network relationships. It was turned around by someone who was willing to spend 3 weeks learning German, who understood that supply chain problems are often communication problems, and who recognized that success in international business requires cultural intelligence, not just financial acumen. The room was so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Every executive present was beginning to understand not just what had happened, but how completely they had misunderstood what was happening around them for the past 3 years. They were realizing that while they had been focused on office politics and credit claiming, real leadership had been occurring right under their noses, executed by someone they had dismissed as irrelevant to the serious business of corporate strategy. The Australian subsidiary that went from hemorrhaging money to becoming our most profitable regional operation didn't succeed because someone applied standard business school methodologies or relied on their existing network of contacts, I said, my voice gaining strength and confidence with each word. It succeeded because someone was willing to spend 6 weeks in Sydney learning Australian business culture, because someone recognized that what works in American markets doesn't automatically work in global markets, and because someone understood that innovation requires thinking beyond the limitations of traditional approaches. I paused, letting the weight of these revelations settle over the room. What I was describing wasn't just a recitation of past successes, it was a demonstration of a completely different approach to leadership, one that valued adaptability over rigidity, cultural intelligence over assumed superiority, and collaborative problem-solving over hierarchical command and control management. The supply chain negotiations that protected our profit margins during the global disruptions didn't succeed because of aggressive negotiation tactics or threats to take our business elsewhere, I continued. They succeeded because someone took the time to build genuine relationships with suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand, because someone understood that long-term partnerships are more valuable than short-term cost savings, and because someone recognized that in a global economy, your competitive advantage comes from the quality of your relationships, not the power of your position. Now I could see understanding dawning on faces throughout the room, could see executives mentally reviewing their own approaches to these kinds of challenges, could see some of them realizing that they had been thinking about leadership in ways that were not just outdated, but actually counterproductive in the modern business environment. What I want everyone in this room to understand, I said, my voice now carrying the full authority of my new position, is that the future of Sterling Industries will be built on merit, not assumptions, on competence, not connections, on results, not rhetoric. We will succeed because we have the best people in the right positions, making decisions based on evidence rather than prejudice, creating value rather than just claiming credit for value that others have created. The applause that began was tentative at first, uncertain, as if the audience wasn't quite sure how to respond to what they had just witnessed, but it built gradually, gaining strength and conviction as more and more people in the room began to understand that they weren't just witnessing a changing of the guard, but a fundamental shift in how Sterling Industries would operate going forward. James Davenport sat frozen in his seat, not applauding, his face a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and what looked like the dawning realization that his career at Sterling Industries had just taken a very different trajectory than he had been anticipating. Jennifer Walsh was applauding enthusiastically, her face showing what looked like genuine admiration, and perhaps relief that the company would be led by someone she could actually respect. Marcus Chen was smiling broadly, clearly impressed by what he had just witnessed, and probably reassessing his own career prospects under new leadership. And David Kumar looked like he was already mentally preparing to align himself with the new power structure that had just been revealed. But the applause wasn't just about acknowledging my promotion or recognizing my past achievements. It was about something deeper, something more significant. It was about the recognition that excellence doesn't always look the way people expect it to look, that leadership doesn't always come from the sources people assume it will come from, and that the most dangerous assumption in any organization is that competence is distributed according to traditional demographics or conventional expectations. As the applause continued, I found myself thinking about all the moments over the past 3 years when I could have given up, when I could have accepted the limitations that others tried to place on me, when I could have internalized the doubts and dismissals and allowed them to define my sense of what was possible. But I hadn't. Not because I was trying to prove something to people like James Davenport, but because I understood something that many people in corporate environments never figure out. The best revenge against those who underestimate you is not to defeat them directly, but to become so successful that their opinions become irrelevant. When the applause finally died down, I stepped back to the microphone for one final comment. "There's one more thing I want to say," I began, my voice carrying easily through the room. "To those of you who have supported me, who have recognized my contributions, and who have treated me as a colleague and an equal rather than an outsider or an anomaly, thank you. Your professionalism and integrity have made it possible for me to focus on the work, rather than on defending my right to do the work." I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room one more time. "And to those of you who have spent the past 3 years assuming that I was here as some kind of diversity initiative rather than as a strategic asset to this company, I want you to know that I don't hold grudges. But I do remember. And going forward, I will be making personnel decisions based on competence, character, and contribution to our collective success. I suggest that everyone in this room take some time to consider which of those categories best describes their value to Sterling Industries." The message was clear without being explicitly threatening, professional without being passive, and definitive without being unnecessarily confrontational. I was establishing the new rules of engagement, making it clear that the old assumptions and behaviors would no longer be tolerated, but doing so in a way that gave everyone the opportunity to adapt to the new reality rather than simply punishing them for their past mistakes. As I handed the microphone back to my father and walked back toward my table, I could feel the shift in energy throughout the room. Conversations that had been suspended during the announcement were resuming, but with a completely different quality. People were no longer talking about quarterly projections or market share statistics. They were talking about what had just happened, what it meant for the company, and what it meant for their own careers. At table 7, the dynamic had changed completely. James Davenport was sitting in stunned silence, occasionally shaking his head, as if he couldn't quite believe what had just occurred. Jennifer Walsh immediately stood as I approached, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Congratulations, Amara," she said, and I could hear genuine respect in her voice. "I have to admit, I'm embarrassed that I didn't see this coming, but I'm excited about what this means for the company's future." Marcus Chen was next, offering his congratulations with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. "This explains so much," he said, shaking his head with a rueful smile. "I kept wondering how our international operations were running so smoothly, how we were solving problems that had stumped other companies in our industry. Now I understand." He paused, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry if I ever underestimated your role here. I promise that won't happen again." David Kumar was more cautious in his approach, clearly still processing the implications of what he had just learned. "Congratulations," he said formally, but I could see in his eyes that he was calculating how to position himself advantageously under the new leadership structure. It wasn't personal ambition that I saw there, but professional survival instinct, the recognition that the rules of the game had just changed dramatically, and that adapting quickly would be crucial for his continued success at Sterling Industries. But it was James Davenport's reaction that was most telling. He remained seated while the others offered their congratulations, staring down at his empty wine glass, as if it contained answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. When I finally sat back down at the table, he looked up at me with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was certainly some of that. It wasn't embarrassment, though that was clearly present as well. It was something closer to bewilderment. The look of someone whose fundamental understanding of how the world works had just been completely overturned. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did this happen? How did I not see this coming?" It wasn't really a question directed at me. It was more like he was talking to himself, trying to make sense of a reality that didn't match his expectations or assumptions. I could have been cruel in that moment. I could have reminded him of every dismissive comment, every assumption about my qualifications, every time he had taken credit for my work. I could have pointed out that his failure to see this coming was exactly the kind of blindness that made him unsuitable for leadership in a rapidly changing business environment. I could have made him feel as small and irrelevant as he had tried to make me feel over the past 3 years. Instead, I chose a different approach. "James," I said quietly, leaning forward slightly so that our conversation wouldn't be overheard by the rest of the table. "You didn't see this coming because you were looking for leadership in all the traditional places, expecting it to come from all the traditional sources. You assumed that power and competence were distributed according to the patterns you were familiar with, rather than recognizing that the business world is changing in ways that require different kinds of leaders." He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been respect. "But how was I supposed to know? You never said anything, never claimed credit for the Hamburg turnaround or the Australian success. You just let me take credit for work that wasn't mine. I let you reveal who you really were," I replied simply. "I let you demonstrate your character, your competence, and your integrity through your own choices and actions. You chose to take credit for work you hadn't done. You chose to dismiss my qualifications based on assumptions rather than evidence. You chose to see me as a diversity hire rather than as a strategic asset. Those were your choices, James, not mine." The weight of this realization seemed to settle over him like a physical presence. For the first time in the 3 years I had known him, James Davenport looked genuinely humbled, genuinely uncertain about his place in the corporate hierarchy he had navigated so confidently for so long. "What happens now?" he asked, and I could hear real concern in his voice. Not just concern about his career prospects, but concern about his understanding of himself, his place in the business world, and his ability to adapt to a reality that was very different from what he had assumed it to be. "Now you have a choice," I said, maintaining my calm, professional tone. "You can continue to operate according to the old assumptions, the old biases, the old ways of thinking about leadership and competence. If you make that choice, you'll find that Sterling Industries under my leadership is not a comfortable place for you to work." I paused, letting the implications of this sink in. "Or you can recognize that excellence comes in many forms, that leadership requires adaptability and humility, and that your value to this company will be determined by your contributions, not your assumptions." The conversation at table 7 had become subdued, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet reflection that occurs when people are processing significant new information, when they're reassessing their understanding of complex situations, when they're trying to figure out how to move forward in a world that has suddenly revealed itself to be very different from what they thought it was. As the evening wound down, as executives began to leave the ballroom and return to their hotel rooms or their cars, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about one company, or one promotion, or one woman breaking through barriers that had been placed in her path. This was about the fundamental shift that occurs when organizations finally align their leadership with their actual talent, when they stop making assumptions about competence based on traditional demographics, when they recognize that their competitive advantage lies in identifying and empowering their best people, regardless of what those people look like or where they come from. Sterling Industries would be different under my leadership, not because I was determined to prove a point or settle old scores, but because I understood something that many corporate leaders never figure out. The most successful organizations are those that create environments where excellence can emerge from anywhere, where merit is recognized and rewarded regardless of its source, and where leadership is defined by results rather than by conformity to traditional expectations. As I prepared to leave the ballroom, my father approached me with the kind of smile that only comes from watching someone you love achieve something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. "How does it feel?" he asked, and I could hear the pride in his voice, the satisfaction of a mentor who had successfully prepared his student for the challenges ahead. "It feels like the beginning," I replied, and I meant it. Tonight had been about recognition, about vindication, about the satisfaction of seeing excellence finally acknowledged and rewarded. But tomorrow would be about something much more important. Using this position to build the kind of organization that creates opportunities for other people who have been underestimated, dismissed, or assumed to be less capable than they actually are. Beautiful souls, we've reached the end of this incredible journey, but before we close this chapter of Black Revenge Diaries, I want you to really think about what we've just witnessed together. This wasn't just a story about one woman's rise to power. This was a masterclass in strategic patience, in letting excellence speak louder than words, and in understanding that sometimes the most devastating response to prejudice is simply being undeniably, unquestionably brilliant at what you do. Amara didn't need to scream or fight or demand recognition. She simply became so indispensable, so excellent, so clearly the best person for the job that silence became impossible and denial became laughable. So here's my question for you, and I really want you to answer this in the comments below. Is the most satisfying revenge the kind you execute yourself, or the kind that your own excellence executes for you? Because what we've seen tonight is proof that sometimes the best way to defeat those who underestimate you is not to fight them directly, but to become so successful that their opinions become irrelevant, their assumptions become embarrassing, and their prejudices become their own career. Limitations rather than yours. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself cheering for Amara's strategic brilliance and quiet confidence, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe to Black Revenge Diaries for more stories about turning discrimination into determination, prejudice into power, and underestimation into unstoppable success. Because every time someone assumes you don't belong, every time someone questions your qualifications, every time someone tries to reduce your presence to a quota, or a favor, or a lucky break, remember Amara Sterling and remember that the best revenge is becoming everything they said you could never be, and then some. The ballroom was nearly empty now. The tables cleared. The lights brightened. The magic of the evening settling into memory and corporate legend. As I walked toward the exit, I passed James Davenport one final time. He was standing near the doors, apparently waiting for his car, looking lost in thought and perhaps lost in general. When he saw me approaching, he straightened slightly, as if coming to attention, and for a moment I thought he might say something else, might offer some final comment or apology or explanation. Instead, he simply nodded slightly, a gesture that contained acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps the beginning of understanding. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation that some people might have expected, the explosive moment of triumph that movies and television shows would have scripted. It was something quieter, more subtle, and ultimately more powerful. The recognition that excellence had spoken, that merit had been rewarded, and that the old assumptions about who deserves power and why they deserve it had been permanently altered. As I stepped out into the cool December evening, breathing the crisp air, and feeling the weight of new responsibility settling over my shoulders, I realized that James Davenport's comment about racial quotas had been exactly what it appeared to be. A revelation of his own limitations, his own blindness, his own inability to recognize competence when it didn't conform to his expectations. But it had also been something more than that. It had been the final test, the last opportunity for the old guard to reveal their true nature before the new era began. Tomorrow, Sterling Industries would begin operating under different principles, guided by different values, and led by someone who understood that the future belongs to organizations that can identify and develop talent wherever it exists, regardless of what that talent looks like or where it comes from. Tonight had been about vindication and recognition, about the satisfaction of seeing years of strategic patience finally rewarded. But tomorrow would be about something much more important. Building the kind of company that creates opportunities for excellence to emerge and thrive, regardless of the obstacles that others might try to place in its path. The valet brought my car around, and as I settled into the driver's seat, I allowed myself one final moment of reflection on the evening's events. 3 years ago, when James Davenport and executives like him had first dismissed me as a diversity hire, as someone who was there to fulfill quotas rather than contribute value, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. They had underestimated me so completely that I was able to work without their interference, to build relationships without their competition, and to develop solutions without their attempts to claim credit until it was too late for them to matter. Their prejudice had become my camouflage, their assumptions had become my strategic advantage, and their blindness had become the foundation of my success. Tonight, in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in our industry, that foundation had been revealed. Those assumptions had been shattered, and that blindness had been exposed for exactly what it was, a limitation that belonged to them, not to me. As I drove through the quiet streets toward home, toward sleep, toward the beginning of a new chapter in my career and my life, I thought about all the young women and men of color who were just starting their careers, who were sitting in meetings where they were the only one who looked like them, who were wondering if they really belonged in the rooms where decisions were made and futures were shaped. I thought about what I would tell them, what advice I would offer, what encouragement I could provide based on what I had learned over the past 3 years. I would tell them that excellence is always the best response to those who question your qualifications, that competence is always more powerful than prejudice, and that the most devastating revenge against those who underestimate you is simply becoming everything they said you could never be. I would tell them that the journey is not easy, that there will be moments when they want to respond to ignorance with anger, to prejudice with confrontation, to dismissal with demands for immediate recognition. But I would also tell them that strategic patience is more powerful than reactive anger, that quiet confidence is more convincing than loud protests, and that the most satisfying victories are those that occur when your own excellence becomes so undeniable that your critics are forced to acknowledge it publicly, completely, and permanently. The road ahead stretched out before me, illuminated by streetlights and possibilities, and I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to prove that leadership comes in many forms, that excellence emerges from unexpected sources, and that the future belongs to those who can see potential where others see only obstacles. Sterling Industries would be different under my leadership, but not because I was determined to settle old scores or prove old points. It would be different because I understood something that James Davenport and executives like him had never figured out. The most successful organizations are those that create space for excellence to emerge naturally, organically, and authentically, regardless of what that excellence looks like or where it comes from. Tonight had been the end of one story, the completion of a 3-year journey from underestimation to recognition, from assumption to acknowledgement, from prejudice to respect. But it was also the beginning of something much more significant. The opportunity to build the kind of organization that I had needed when I was starting my career, the kind of company that sees potential rather than demographics, merit rather than tradition, and excellence rather than expectation. As I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat for a moment in the quiet darkness, reflecting on the magnitude of what had just occurred and the responsibility that came with it. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of transforming Sterling Industries into the kind of company that our industry needed, that our employees deserved, and that our future demanded. Tonight, I would simply savor the sweet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, just sometimes, excellence really does triumph over ignorance, merit really does overcome prejudice, and the best revenge really is living well, succeeding spectacularly, and becoming everything that those who underestimated you said was impossible. The house was dark and quiet as I made my way inside, but I wasn't tired despite the long evening and the emotional intensity of what had occurred. Instead, I felt energized, focused, and ready for the challenges that lay ahead. James Davenport's comment about racial quotas had been intended to diminish me, to put me in what he considered my proper place, to remind me that I was an outsider in a world that belonged to people like him. Instead, it had become the perfect setup for the most satisfying moment of professional vindication I could have imagined. It had allowed my father to demonstrate not just my qualifications, but the blindness of those who had failed to recognize them. It had created the dramatic contrast that made the evening's revelation not just surprising, but devastating to those who had built their assumptions on prejudice rather than evidence. As I changed out of my evening wear and prepared for bed, I found myself smiling at the memory of James Davenport's face when he realized that the diversity hire he had dismissed so casually was actually the person who would determine his professional future. It wasn't cruelty that made me smile. but the pure satisfaction of seeing justice served, excellence recognized, and assumptions shattered by the weight of undeniable reality. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that tonight's announcement was not just recognition of past achievements, but a promise of future success. Tomorrow would be the first day of Sterling Industries' new era, the beginning of a transformation that would demonstrate what becomes possible when organizations finally align their leadership with their actual talent. But tonight, as I settled into bed and reflected on the evening's events, I allowed myself to savor the perfect moment when James Davenport's prejudice met my father's pride, when assumption met reality, when the old guard's dismissal met the new generation's undeniable excellence. It had been worth the wait, worth the patience, worth every moment of strategic silence that had led to this spectacular vindication. They said I was just a racial quota at the company dinner. Then my dad said, "She's my successor." And in that moment, everything changed, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever underestimated what excellence looks like when it doesn't conform to their expectations. The best revenge, I had learned, is not the kind you plan or execute. The best revenge is the kind that your own brilliance creates, naturally, inevitably, and absolutely devastatingly.